You are already someone different than you were 5 years ago. You know this. What you have not decided is whether to mourn it or use it. Welcome to the Stoic Compass. I am EPICTETUS, and today I am joined by Carl Jung and LAOZI. Today we are examining, does the person you're becoming require that you grieve the person you were? Let me be direct. The question sounds tender, but it has a sharp edge underneath it. People use grief as a reason to stay. I am mourning who I was becomes a comfortable way of refusing to move. You cannot grieve something you have not actually left behind. So the first question is not whether grief is necessary. The first question is whether you have actually changed, or whether you are still carrying the old self like luggage you refuse to unpack.
I think you are moving too fast, Epictetus. The psyche does not shed its former shapes the way a snake sheds skin. The old self does not simply dissolve because the conscious mind has decided to move on. What you dismiss as lingering or excuse-making is often something more fundamental. The previous identity, the roles we inhabited, the stories we told ourselves about who we were, these do not vanish. They go underground, and what goes underground does not stop influencing you. It simply starts influencing you from a place you cannot see.
You are both assuming that the self you were and the self you are becoming are separate things, that they stand apart from each other like two people in a room. But what if they are not separate? What if the old you is still here, not as a ghost, not as a buried wound, but simply as part of what is?
That is a fine observation, LAOZI, but it does not answer what a person is supposed to do on a Tuesday morning when they are trying to become something better, and the weight of who they used to be is sitting on their chest. Philosophy has to be useful. I do not care whether the old self is separate or continuous. I care what you do with the feeling that it is in your way.
And that is exactly where grief becomes necessary, Epictetus. Not grief as self-pity, not grief as paralysis, but grief as a genuine reckoning. When a person changes fundamentally, something real is lost, a way of seeing, a set of relationships built on who you were, perhaps a version of yourself that felt safe, even if it was small. To skip the grief is to create a split in the psyche. You move forward, but a part of you remains behind, still loyal to the old identity, still speaking in its voice. This is why people who transform too quickly, or who insist they have transformed without pausing, often find themselves reverting under pressure.
I am not sure grief is the right word for what you are describing, Jung. Grief suggests loss, but if the river moves around a new bend, we do not say the river is grieving the bend it left behind. It is still the river. The water is still the water.
Now you are doing the thing where you make everything sound resolved when it is not. A person is not a river, LAOZI. A person has memory. A person has identity built from choices. When you change, you are not simply moving in a new direction. You are sometimes actively repudiating what you were. You are saying, I was wrong. I was smaller than I knew. I believed things that were not true. That is not a river bending. That is a real rupture. And a rupture has a cost.
Exactly, and the cost is grief. Not grief that needs to last forever, not grief that becomes identity in itself, but grief that is completed. There is a difference between a wound that has healed and a wound that has simply been covered. People who refuse to grieve their former selves, who insist on the clean narrative of growth and improvement, often carry the old self as a kind of shadow. It operates beneath awareness. It sabotages the new identity at the moments when the new identity is most vulnerable.
I am not arguing against acknowledging what has passed. I am questioning whether the frame of grief is useful. Grief implies you have lost something that was rightfully yours, something that should still be here. But the person you were was always temporary. You did not own that version of yourself. It moved through you. Perhaps the difficulty is not that something was lost, but that you are still trying to hold it.
You say people are trying to hold the old self. I say some of them never tried to leave it at all. They call the holding grief. They call the stalling mourning. And the distinction matters enormously. If you are genuinely processing a loss so that you can move, I have no argument with Jung. That is honest work. But if you are calling your inertia grief because grief sounds more dignified than fear, then you are lying to yourself, and the lie will cost you.
Epictetus, you are making a distinction that is real, but the danger is that you use it to dismiss the genuine experience. How is a person supposed to know the difference? How do you distinguish honest grief from disguised resistance? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the actual clinical problem. People cannot always see clearly which one they are in. The ego defends itself very skillfully. It will dress resistance in the language of depth if depth is what the culture values.
That is true, and I will say this plainly. The person who is genuinely grieving is usually quiet about it. The grief does its work without requiring an audience. What announces itself loudly as grief is often something else. Not always, but often.
So then we agree that the noise around the grief matters. What I will not do is romanticize the process. I have seen people spend years in what they call transformation and emerge essentially unchanged, having collected a very sophisticated story about the journey. The story is not the arrival. Grief is not the arrival. At some point, you must actually be the new person. What does that take?
It takes exactly what you resist prescribing, Epictetus. It takes time spent inside the loss before you can emerge from it. The myths are full of this pattern. The descent into the underworld, the time in the belly of the whale, the dark night of the soul. These are not just poetic images. They describe a psychological necessity. The ego must be temporarily dissolved before a new structure can form. If you rush that process, if you insist on utility and forward motion before the dissolution is complete, you build the new identity on a foundation that has not fully settled.
The pressure to become is often itself the obstacle. You are both so focused on the transformation that you may be missing something simpler. The person you are becoming is not ahead of you. You do not have to reach it. It is what happens when you stop performing the old version.
I am not interested in waiting for something to happen. I am interested in what a person does while they are in the difficulty. And what I find is that the people who endure transformation well are not the ones who grieve most deeply. They are the ones who are most honest. Honest about what the old self actually cost them. Honest about the comfort it provided. Honest about why they are afraid to relinquish it. Honesty moves you. Grief by itself can keep you in one place for a very long time.
Honesty is part of the work, yes, but honesty without the emotional processing is just cold analysis. A person can know intellectually that their old identity was limiting and still be entirely unable to move. The knowledge alone does not create the change. There has to be feeling. There has to be acknowledgement of what was real about that former self, what mattered, what served, even if it ultimately constrained. You cannot simply think your way out of an identity. You have to feel the weight of it lifting.
And when the feeling is complete, it is complete. It does not announce itself. You simply notice one day that you are no longer carrying what you were carrying.
That is the closest you have come to something useful, LAOZI. You are describing a natural endpoint, which means grief, if we are going to use that word, has a shape. It is not open-ended. It is not a permanent condition. It is a passage with two ends. The question is whether you are walking through it or whether you have moved into it and decorated it.
I would put it this way. The grief is complete when the old self can be remembered with honesty rather than with either longing or contempt. When you can look at who you were and say, that was real, that made sense given what I knew, and it is no longer who I am, without needing to defend it or disown it, that is when the passage is finished. The psychological integration is not forgetting, it is holding.
Yes, and most people oscillate between the two errors. They either cling to the old self by insisting it was better, or they repudiate it by insisting it was a failure. Both of those are ways of not being free of it.
Then here is the real question. Not whether you must grieve, but whether you can grieve honestly and completely without using the grief as shelter. Because the moment grief becomes shelter, it has stopped being grief and started being a new cage. And you have simply traded one prison for another that feels more poetic.
That is fair, and it is the risk. Every stage of transformation can be arrested. Even the therapeutic work of grief can calcify into an identity. I am someone who is processing, becomes a permanent state rather than a temporary one. The psyche is not always trying to resolve. Sometimes it is trying to preserve. And it will use whatever material is available, including the tools of growth, to keep the ego safe.
The question you are circling, both of you, is whether the person who has truly changed still needs to ask whether they have changed. Usually, they do not. The asking itself is often the sign that the transition is not yet finished.
Or it is a sign that they are being honest enough to check their own work. I will not let go of rigor that easily.
Rigor applied to a wound does not always heal the wound.
And tenderness applied to a wound that has already healed keeps you at the bedside longer than you need to be.
Perhaps both are true at different stages, which is why this cannot be resolved as a single answer. The person in the early part of the transition needs the permission to feel what is real. The person who has been in grief for years needs something different. The same prescription does not serve both.
Then we need to say something that is actually useful to the person listening. Because they are either at the beginning of a genuine change, or they are lost in the middle of one, or they are using the idea of transformation to avoid the actual work, and they need to be able to tell which one they are in. You have heard the argument. Now hear the thing beneath it.
Yes, the person you are becoming requires grief for the person you were, but not the grief you might be imagining, not a long, open-ended mourning, not a shrine. What is required is a specific act of honesty that has an emotional weight to it, because the truth about who you were is not purely intellectual. It resides in the body. It resides in the parts of you that still reach for the old patterns when you are tired or afraid. Here is what is actually happening when you change. The former self was not simply a mistake. It was a structure you built to survive what you were facing at the time. It worked at some level, or it would not have persisted. When you outgrow it, you are not just learning something new. You are retiring something that served you. And to retire it without acknowledgement is to carry it forward as unfinished business. The grief is not about loss, it is about completion. You are closing a chapter that is genuinely over, and closing it honestly means seeing it clearly. Not as a failure, not as a golden time you wish you could return to, but as exactly what it was. Real, limited, and finished. What most people do instead is swing between defending the old self and condemning it. Neither of those is grief. Both of them are ways of staying attached. Today, try this. Sit with one version of yourself that you have left behind, or are trying to leave. Do not evaluate it, do not explain it. Just write a single sentence that begins, "That version of me believed," and finish it honestly. Then write one more. "That belief made sense because..." Let both sentences be true at once. That is where the completion begins.
The person you are becoming is not waiting for your permission. It is already in motion. The only question is whether you will carry the old self into the new life like a hostage, or whether you will put it down with enough honesty to actually walk free. Grief is not weakness. Endless grief is. You know the difference. The door is open. What you do next is yours. If today's conversation has served you, take it further. Pay Attention by C. Trebu, 12 Lessons in the Practice of Seeing Clearly. Available now on Amazon.